Okay, so we're diving deep into feminism today. You know, you sent over a ton of sources, and honestly, I was blown away by some of them. Like that story about Alice Paul and the hunger strikes.
Oh, yeah.
To win women the right to vote, intense.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
Big time. So, let's get to the heart of it. One source defines feminism as the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of all genders. Pretty straightforward, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting, how such a simple statement could be so powerful and how it really challenges people's preconceptions about what feminism actually is.
Yeah, for sure.
Because so many people still have these ideas that, it's about female dominance or hating men, which is obviously not the case at all.
Right, right.
When you strip away all of that, those misconceptions, it really boils down to just this basic principle of equality.
Equality. It's a word we hear so much, but it feels like it's become kind of loaded. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings about feminism that you've come across? And how does that simple definition, that core definition of equality, help to clear things up?
Well, I think one of the most persistent misconceptions is that feminism is about elevating women above men,
Mm-hmm.
when in reality, it's really about dismantling those systems that privilege one gender over the other
Mm-hmm.
and creating a level playing field actually benefits everyone. It benefits men, too.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
For example, if we challenge these really restrictive gender roles, it can help free men from the pressure of, toxic masculinity,
Oh, interesting.
which can actually lead to better emotional health for men, stronger relationships. It's a win-win for everybody.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's not about a power struggle then, but more about kind of breaking down those rigid structures that limit us all.
Exactly.
Speaking of challenging norms, one of the sources you sent over delves into the evolution of feminism.
Right,
I
right.
mean, it's been around for a while. It's at different phases.
Definitely. And I think it's really crucial to understand that, feminism is not this monolithic entity
Mm-hmm.
frozen in time. It's a dynamic movement that's adapted and evolved over generations.
Yeah.
So you have the first wave with figures like, Alice Paul fighting tirelessly for suffrage.
Right, right.
And that really laid the groundwork for everything that followed. But as that fight for basic rights, progressed, a new layer of complexity emerged with intersectional feminism.
Yeah, that's a term I see all the time, intersectional feminism. Could you maybe break down what it actually means in practice?
Sure. Intersectional feminism basically recognizes that people's experiences of gender inequality are actually shaped by a ton of different factors.
Okay.
Race, class, sexual orientation, disability, all of these things kind of intersect with gender to create these unique challenges, unique forms of oppression.
Excellent.
So, for example, the gender pay gap, it's not uniform across the board.
Mhm.
Women of color, on average, earn considerably less than white women.
Oh.
And then white women, in turn, earn less than men.
Okay, so it's about recognizing that we can't just address gender inequality as this one isolated thing. We have to understand how it interacts with all these other systems of power.
Exactly, exactly. And that's where this concept of reproductive justice comes in. It expands on traditional pro-choice arguments by highlighting the fact that access to safe reproductive health care is often limited by things like race and socioeconomic status. It's a more nuanced and inclusive approach to reproductive rights.
Okay, so going back to Alice Paul for a second, her story is powerful. It shows how hard women fought for the right to vote.
Absolutely.
But it's important to note that her experience wasn't universal, right? Not every woman faced those same obstacles in the same way.
Precisely. And that's a key takeaway from intersectional feminism. Dismantling one form of oppression doesn't automatically dismantle others. It requires a more nuanced understanding of how these systems intertwine.
Okay, so let's move from this historical context to the present day. One of your sources tackles some of these common misconceptions about feminism. One that always kind of bugs me is the idea that feminism is irrelevant in today's world.
Right. Yeah.
We're past all that. It's not needed anymore.
Well, I think one statistic can kind of dismantle that myth pretty effectively.
Get me.
The persistent gender pay gap.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that, on average, women still earn less than men for doing the same work is just clear evidence that, no, we haven't achieved true equality. And this isn't just an abstract concept.
Right.
It has real consequences for women's financial security, career advancement, overall well-being. It's a big deal.
And it's not just limited to pay, right? I mean, I was reading about how, involved fatherhood can have a huge impact on a child's development, emotionally, cognitively, all of that.
Uh-huh.
But there's still so much stigma around men taking on caregiving roles.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And challenging those deeply ingrained stereotypes, that's essential for creating a more just and equitable society for everyone. And that brings us to another pervasive misconception, the idea that feminism is only for women.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't that, like, defeat the whole purpose? If you're advocating for equality, how can you exclude half the population?
Exactly. Everyone benefits from a society where all genders can something like paid parental leave, a policy really championed by feminists.
Okay, yeah.
Not only does it support families, it promotes more equitable parenting, but it also challenges that traditional notion that childcare is just like solely a woman's responsibility.
It reframes that whole conversation,
Exactly.
recognizing the importance of care work and making it a shared responsibility, not just this, like, gendered one.
Exactly. And I think that shift in perspective is key.
Yeah.
Because when you start to break down these really rigid gender roles and expectations, you create a space for everyone to thrive.
You know, this whole conversation is really making me think about some of my own assumptions.
Oh, yeah.
Like how often I just automatically, like, think a doctor is male or, I assume caregiving tasks are for women. These, like, default thought patterns.
It happens to all of us.
Yeah.
It's a process of unlearning those ingrained biases that we all kind of carry around.
hmm
And it takes constant vigilance and self-reflection.
I'm realizing that. Okay, so before we move on, there's something else from the materials you sent that really caught my eye. This idea of feminist futures. It sounds kind of futuristic, right?
Right. It's really about looking beyond just addressing these existing inequalities
Yeah.
and actually envisioning a world where those inequalities never existed in the first place.
Wow.
So thinking about, what would a society truly built on principles of gender equality actually look like?
Mm.
How would our relationships, our work, our families, our entire world be different? It's a big question.
I'm definitely curious to delve into those possibilities, but maybe that's for another deep dive. For now, I think it's time we move on and explore this next source you sent about the future of feminism. It seems like things are evolving so rapidly, especially in the digital age.
Oh, absolutely. The internet and social media have completely transformed the landscape of feminist activism,
Mhm.
connecting people across borders, amplifying voices that were once marginalized. It's like a whole new frontier.
Okay, let's jump in.
Yeah, it's wild, right? Like the internet and social media, they've totally changed how we think about activism.
It's a huge shift. We were just talking about Alice Paul, 100 years ago, hunger strikes.
Right.
And now we have these online movements, hashtag campaigns. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really shows how adaptable feminism is. It's not tied to any one particular way of doing things. It's all about finding what works, what's effective, to challenge the status quo. Right now,
Yeah.
the internet, social media, that's where a lot of that's happening.
That's what this source dives into, all the different ways these online platforms are used, like organizing protests, building these global networks of support. It's pretty amazing to see.
It really is. It's opened up so many possibilities for people to connect and organize in ways we just couldn't before. Like, think about the hashtag #MeToo movement.
Huge.
It sparked this global conversation about sexual harassment and assault. It gave survivors a platform to share their stories. It even held abusers accountable. That kind of impact, mobilizing people worldwide, that wouldn't have happened without social media.
I remember when that movement took off, it was so powerful to see so many people speaking out. It felt like something was really changing.
It was. It definitely was. And we're seeing that same kind of energy in other movements, the fight for racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights. The internet's become this essential tool for raising awareness, for building those coalitions, putting pressure on people in power to actually address these systemic inequalities.
But I'm guessing there are some downsides too, right? Relying so much on digital activism, the source mentioned a few potential problems with it.
Right, yeah, definitely. I mean, as much good as it can do, the internet has its downsides.
Mhm.
We all know how fast misinformation can spread online and how the algorithms can create these echo chambers that just reinforce people's biases. Plus, there's the online harassment, how it can silence and intimidate people, especially those from marginalized communities. It's a tricky landscape, and it takes some real critical thinking, healthy skepticism to navigate it properly.
Makes sense. Like any tool, really, it can be used in good ways and bad ways. It's important to be aware of its limitations.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the importance of intersectionality, which is something this source also emphasizes.
Oh, right. We talked about that earlier in the context of those historical feminist movements. But it feels even more relevant now with all this online activism.
Totally. Because Online spaces, they're just as prone to those same biases and power dynamics that exist in the offline world. So as feminism embraces this digital activism, it's got to make sure that those online spaces are inclusive, representative of diverse experiences. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose.
It's not just about having access to the internet, then. It's about making sure that those platforms are actually serving the needs of marginalized communities and, like, actually amplifying their voices authentically.
That's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about representation within the movement itself. It's also about, how we use these platforms to actually advocate for policies, solutions that are intersectional.
Okay, I'm following you, but could you give me, like, a concrete example how that would actually look in practice?
Sure, let's take climate change, for example. Now, on the surface, it might not seem like a classic feminist issue, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at it through that intersectional lens, you start to see how the impacts of climate change, they really hit women and marginalized communities the hardest.
That's true. I've read about that, how it's often women in developing countries who are disproportionately affected by climate disasters, like having to walk further to get water, increased risks of displacement, violence.
Exactly. So an intersectional approach to climate activism would mean, centering those voices, the experiences of those most impacted, advocating for policies that actually address those vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
Environmental justice and gender justice, they're deeply intertwined.
Wow, you're right. It's all connected, the bigger picture. I'm getting that now.
And this source, it challenges us to even further broaden what we consider a feminist issue. It points to the growing focus on economic justice within the movement, recognizing how capitalist systems, they often just perpetuate gender inequality.
I'm really intrigued by that connection, how those two things relate. Can you break it down for me a bit more?
Sure. It's about looking at things like the gender pay gap, the fact that care work is so undervalued, the way women's labor is exploited, and seeing them not just as individual problems, but as symptoms of a larger system. The source argues that, just advocating for individual women to climb that corporate ladder within the existing structures, it's not enough. We have to challenge the very foundations of those structures. Imagine a more just and equitable economic system altogether.
Okay, so it's not just about rearranging the pieces within the current system. It's about completely changing the game.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of feminist futures comes in.
Right. We touched on that a little earlier. Can we dive a little deeper into what that actually means? What does a feminist future look like?
It's about moving beyond just, reacting to the injustices that exist and actually being proactive, imagining a world where they never existed in the first place.
Wow, I love that.
It's about asking, what would a society built on those principles of gender equality actually look like? What systems would we need? What structures? What kind of relationships? How would we make that vision a reality?
Okay, I'm totally hooked. Paint me a picture here. What are some of the key elements that this source highlights about those feminist futures?
I think one of the most transformative aspects is a total reimagining of care work. Right now, so much of the labor that goes into sustaining life, childcare, elder care, all that housework, it's also undervalued,
Yeah.
underpaid, and it falls disproportionately on women. A feminist future, it would recognize how fundamentally important that work is, and it would make sure it's valued, compensated fairly, and that the responsibility is shared equally between all genders.
It's about challenging that deeply rooted idea that all this is women's work and saying, no, caring for others, that's essential for a thriving society. It's not just an individual responsibility.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that shift, it would have ripple effects throughout society. We'd have to rethink how we structure work, how we value different kinds of labor, how we allocate resources. It would also mean a more equitable distribution of power with diverse voices at the table, in all levels of decision-making.
So it goes way beyond just individual choices then. It's about systemic change, challenging the very foundation of how our society is set up and building something new.
Exactly.
I'll be honest, it's kind of overwhelming to think about the scale of change we're talking about. It's not just like tweaking a few laws here and there.
Right.
It's about fundamentally rethinking how our entire society works.
It's a tall order, for sure. But this source, I think it does a good job of breaking those big ideas down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Okay, good.
It moves away from feminist futures and focuses more on everyday feminism, how we can actually live out those principles in our day-to-day lives. Right now, starting today.
Okay, that's a little less daunting because I'm thinking I can't dismantle the whole patriarchy by myself today, but maybe there are smaller things I can do, in my own life, in my own little world.
That's the whole point. It starts with those small choices we make every day, how we interact with people. Like the source talks about challenging those gender stereotypes in the way we talk.
Uh-huh.
Instead of assuming a doctor is a he or a CEO is a he, right?
Right.
Use gender-neutral
Right.
language or just ask. It's about being aware of those unconscious biases we all have and trying to disrupt them.
Oh, I catch myself doing that all the time. It's crazy how ingrained those assumptions are.
It's a process, unlearning that stuff. And it's not just about language either. It's about being willing to speak up when you hear a sexist joke or a comment,
Oh,
even if it seems like it's all in good fun.
yeah.
Because staying silent, it kind of sends the message that you agree. So we need to create a culture where that kind of stuff, sexism, any form of it, is just not okay.
I get that, but it can be hard sometimes, especially if it's a friend or a family member making those comments. Any tips on like how to handle those conversations in a way that actually gets through to people but isn't, starting a fight?
Well, the source actually gives some pretty good advice on that.
Hmm.
It emphasizes, like, going into those conversations with empathy, really trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Sometimes even just asking a simple question like, hey, what did you mean by that?
Oh, okay.
It can open up a space for, a real conversation and hopefully some reflection. And remember, it's not about winning an argument. It's about, like, planting those seeds, for change.
That's a good point. It's about those long-term shifts in thinking and behavior, not just about convincing someone on the spot.
Exactly. And it's also about understanding that the choices we make as consumers, those can have a real impact too.
Like how?
Supporting businesses owned by women, minorities, buying from companies that actually promote diversity, body positivity, donating to organizations that are working for gender equality. It's about putting your money where your mouth is, aligning your spending with your values.
It's like voting with your wallet. You're supporting the kind of world you want to see.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just spending money. It's about, like, how you consume media too, making a conscious effort to seek out diverse voices, diverse perspectives, supporting artists and creators who are challenging the status quo, and being critical of the way gender is portrayed in the media you're consuming.
Be an active participant, not just passively taking it all in.
Exactly. And I think that ties back to something we were talking about before, the importance of education.
Oh, right.
Learning about feminist theory, about the history, about the different ways people have been activists. That's a lifelong process, Staying curious, reading books, listening to podcasts, having thoughtful conversations. All those things help us grow, understand things better, broaden our perspectives.
Honestly, this whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
I came in thinking, okay, I have a pretty good handle on this whole feminism thing, but now I realize I've just barely scratched the surface.
That's what's so great about it.
Yeah.
It's a constant evolution, a journey of learning, of growing. And it's a journey we all need to be on if we want to build that more just and equitable world.
So true. And speaking of journeys, this source, it made a point that really resonated with me about the importance of self-care, especially for people doing this kind of work. Social justice, activism, it can be draining.
Oh, absolutely. Burnout is a real thing, especially when you're constantly dealing with injustice, fighting those battles, taking time for yourself, setting boundaries, making sure you're looking after your mental and emotional well-being. That's not selfish. It's crucial.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of yourself to keep going.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. This deep dive, it's been a whirlwind. We've covered so much, the history, the present, where things might be headed in the future.
It's been challenging. It's been inspiring. Definitely eye-opening for sure.
And hopefully it's left you, our listeners, feeling a little more fired up, a little more ready to take these ideas and make them a part of your own lives.
Because at the end of the day, feminism is not just some abstract idea. It's about the choices we make, the conversations we have, the actions we take, and the world we're building together.
So as we finish up this deep dive, we'll leave you with one last question to think about. How can you bring a little bit of that everyday feminism into your own life? What's one small step you can take today to make a difference?
Hold on to that question. And remember, even the smallest actions can ripple outwards, creating bigger change. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. And until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight.